Welcome to the Logic and Quantitative Reasoning Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Hamadi. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University and one of the designers of this course. Wherever you are, if you're driving or doing dishes or laundry or unwinding after a long day at work, I hope you're having a great day. If you've taken my advice from last week about practicing every day, you're probably listening to this podcast early on in the 5th week. We're over half the way done. For this week, since we'll be using assumptions, I thought it might be interesting to think about assumptions just in general. So as a student, I was often warned against using assumptions. Sometimes with the old proverb, when you assume you make an... Well, anyway, that's the proverb. What if assumptions were bad? Could logic or reasoning be done at all? Well, let's take a look at a famous criticism of logic. Does logic assume too much? So this is often called the skeptical objection to logic, and it goes something like this. All right, you want to establish something. Okay, this is the conclusion of your proof. Well, how do you establish it? Well, you start with premises, and then you use those premises to give you a conclusion. Well, how do you know the premises are true? It seems like those premises are themselves conclusions of other arguments. You'd have to prove those to know that they're reliable or true enough to be used in your new argument. Well, so for each premise, you would need an argument showing that that premise is true. So that argument, the one that shows that the premise is true, that one is going to have its own premises. All right, well, those premises, where did they come from? They're also going to need proofs. All right, you see how this is going to go. You just keep asking for proofs of the premises, and then that argument is going to have premises. Well, those premises need proofs too, and so you need arguments for those. And you have this endless regress, this endless, infinitely long regress of new arguments to establish those premises, which then need arguments to establish those premises, which need arguments to establish those premises, and so on. So as a result, you never get reasoning off the ground. There's going to be something that you're going to have to assume. This is where the skeptical objection to logical arguments does its final blow. You have to assume something, they're going to say. You have to assume some of the premises. But then, if you're going to assume something, why not just assume the conclusion? I mean, what difference does it make? You're assuming. Why go through the process of trying to show this proof, right? Trying to show how the premises, if you follow the rules correctly, get you to the conclusion, when you just assumed the premises to begin with? Why not just assume the conclusion and be done with it? Unless you wanted to make it look like you were doing a proof, to make it appear to people that you are actually moving from one piece of knowledge to the next, when really all we're doing is moving from one assumption to the next assumption. So, according to this objection, the skeptical objection to logical arguments, all logical arguments are merely assumptions, which means every time you see a proof, it's really just a fallacy. The skeptical argument has a second part that may be just as difficult as the first. So you've got this proof, and the skeptic looks at the proof and says, well, okay, I see you've got these premises, and I see you've got this conclusion, and you've got this other component that you're using to move from the premises to the conclusion. This other component are the rules, the logical rules, things like modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, De Morgan's rule, and so on. These are the rules. So you have these three components, right? The premises, the rules, and then combining those two give you the conclusion. And the skeptic says, well, let's say I grant some of these assumptions that are your premises. Let's just say I grant them. Like, okay, maybe one of your premises is something like, the sky looks blue to me. Like, okay, fine. It looks blue to me too, so let's move on. But what about these rules? How do you know for sure that modus ponens works every single time? Wouldn't you need some kind of proof for that? And what kind of proof would be necessary to show that modus ponens works all the time? Well, here's what you'd have to do. You would have to, and this is the way the skeptic would argue, you would have to take every circumstance possible that modus ponens would apply to. Every time you would have a conditional. And you'd have to show that in that case, modus ponens worked. And then when you compiled all of the cases of every single time modus ponens has ever been used, then you would be able to know for sure that modus ponens is reliable. If you don't do that hard work of actually testing it against every possible scenario, then you're just generalizing from a small subset of the data. So you could say, yeah, here's an area where modus ponens works, right? You could say, well, if like a classic modus ponens argument, right? Like if the creature is a mammal, then the creature is an animal, and the creature is a mammal, therefore the creature is an animal. Well, okay, modus ponens works in that circumstance, but how do I know modus ponens is going to work in every circumstance? How do I know it's going to work in the circumstance of this particular argument that you're giving me? Well, the only way I would know that is if I had first examined every single time that modus ponens could be used. And if I haven't done that, then I'm just assuming that it'll work. I've seen it work in a few things, so now I'm going to assume that it's going to work with everything. But why? This is what the skeptic would say. Why on earth should I make that assumption? Why shouldn't I just say, prove that the rules are true? Prove that the rules are reliable. And then in order to do that, what are you going to need? More premises, more rules. You're going to need rules that talk about how to follow the rules. And before you know it, the skeptic is going to say, we've just made an entire castle out of thin air, and all of it is just assumptions. As soon as you doubt the assumptions, you might as well just throw the argument away entirely. Welcome back. How could we answer the skeptic? Well, one thing to consider is that the skeptic is asking us to start an inquiry, start a process of discovery from nowhere, from no starting point. There's got to be a starting point in there somewhere. You've got to begin with something. You can't begin with nothing, because out of nothing, nothing comes. So you must start somewhere, and whatever that place is that you start could be called, fairly, I think, a assumption. So assumptions aren't bad. Assumptions aren't harmful. Assumptions are merely a starting point, a place to begin. In some fields of inquiry, these are called axioms, right? So this axiom would be your initial starting point or theory that allows the rest of the discipline to get started. So for example, one of the axioms for biology is that there's such a thing as a living creature. And without the belief or the starting point of life, there's nothing to discover within biology. Same thing goes with something like psychology, that if you don't believe there's such a thing as a mind or thought, then what on earth would psychology study? Like, it's got to start somewhere. So in the case of logic, where does it start? Well, it starts with premises, conclusions, and rules. And without those, it's not possible for the discipline to even get off the ground. But every discipline needs an axiom of some sort. Every endeavor begins with a starting place. So for the skeptic to say, you must start, but without a starting place, it boggles the mind how that would even be possible. How could assumption in that case be bad? The issue with what the skeptic is doing is that they're taking something that is actually good, right? An assumption for the case of discovery, and lumping it in with the bad kind of assumptions, the kind of assumptions that we warn people about, like don't judge a book by its cover, or don't judge someone without getting to know them first, or when we talk about walking a mile in someone else's shoes, we're warning against a type of assumption that causes us to avoid the truth or to ignore the truth by thinking that we already know what it is. But that's not the kind of assumption that we're talking about with premises and a conclusion. We're talking about having a starting point at all for where we're going to begin our discoveries, for where we're going to run the race. Like imagine running a race without a starting line. How would you even know who won? Like there has to be a starting point for really anything. One other problem with this type of skeptical argument is that it assumes that all assumptions are equal. So some assumptions I think are safer than other assumptions. So let me give you an example. So I'm assuming right now that I'm awake. Because if I was asleep, then me sitting here recording this is a waste of time. I should be flying or turning into some kind of animal or whatever it is people do in their dreams. But if I'm awake, then my work has some kind of meaning. And I think that's a pretty safe assumption. I mean, I don't know for sure. It's impossible to know without any level of doubt whatsoever that you're not asleep. Because I've had some pretty vivid dreams that I woke up the next morning and was actually surprised that I had been asleep this whole time because of how vivid and how realistic the dream was. But that's pretty rare, and this seems like the kind of thing that I would be doing while awake, and there's certain feelings that I get from being awake that are hard to duplicate in sleep. It's kind of the way that you can tell when you're sick, it's hard to remember what it was like to feel well. But then once you're well and you remember what it felt like to be sick, you're like, oh, of course, it was obvious that I was sick then. I felt wrong then, but I feel right now. And I think that dreaming and being awake is kind of like that. So I'm assuming that I'm awake, but that's a really safe assumption. I mean, even if I was wrong and I'm dreaming, I might not even change my actions. I might just do the exact same stuff just in case that I was awake and I didn't want to do something terrible like set my house on fire or believe that I could fly and jump off a building or something. Like just in case I'm awake, I should act as though I'm awake if I have some doubts about it. There are other assumptions that are pretty dangerous. So, for example, I could just assume that my political beliefs are all correct, that what I think is the right way to organize a government or the right way to administer justice is the right way. I could just believe that and assume that it's true. But that I don't think is a safe assumption at all. And all I have to do is look and notice that lots of people have disagreements about these things. That they believe one way, I believe a different way. They seem to be good people. So should I just assume that my beliefs are right? No, I think I would probably need to go and try to prove them or gather evidence for them, or maybe look at the opposing side and try to and figure out if what they have to say makes any sense. And those are the kinds of things where I would be careful about my assumptions. But other times, assumptions might be just fine. Like, if my kids tell me that, and this happens occasionally now, if my oldest daughter comes up and puts her arms around me and says, "Dad, I love you," I think it's a safe assumption that she's probably telling the truth. That doesn't seem to be a problem to just assume that someone is telling the truth like that. The main point is, you've got to start from somewhere. So I want to leave you with a really funny story that I used to read my kids, and let's see what you think about it. story is called Little Tuppen. And Little Tuppen is a baby chicken, a chick. And starts coughing on some seeds that he's eating. And so his mom, Cluck Cluck, decides that she has to rescue Little Tuppen and find him some water so he'll stop coughing. And of course, like all of these folk tales, these old style folk tales, like it just keeps going and going, right? So first she goes to the brook, but she doesn't have a cup. So she asks the acorn tree, the oak tree, to give her a cup. The acorn tree says, "No, I'm not going to give you a cup unless you first give me something else." Like I forget what it was that the acorn tree wants. And so then, who has that? Well, I have to go find the person who has that, and that person won't trade with me until they get some leather for a belt. Okay, well, who has leather? Well, the cow has a leather and around her neck as a collar, a leather collar with a bell on it. Maybe she could take the leather from the cow. Well, the cow won't give her the leather belt, the leather collar for the belt until she gets some hay to eat. So she has to go to the farmer and ask the farmer. So in the entire way, each step of the way, Cluck Cluck has to find something to give to that person, find someone to give to that person. And it doesn't seem like it could end at all because no one wants to give Cluck Cluck anything. They'll only do it in exchange. Until, and this is my favorite part of the book, she goes to the mountains because it turns out that somebody needs metal. And so she goes to the mountains and the mines, and there are elves that work in the mines. And the elves who hear her story about needing, all these different things in order to get water to feed to her baby, Little Tuppen, they take pity on her and give her metal. And then she takes the metal. Then the process can start. She takes the metal to the blacksmith who makes the horseshoes, which then gives to this person, gives to that person. And then finally we get to whatever it was the oak tree wanted, who then gives her these acorn caps, which she takes into the water and then brings it to her baby chick, who by this time, if she was really coughing, probably dead by now. But, in the story, it's fine and everything works out. But the lesson of this story is not just that, no one will listen to you or you need to make sure you have something of value to exchange, but that at some point there's this magical power of nature to give you what you need. Like she goes into the mines and collects metal from the elves. And the elves are, I don't know what to say, like the elementary forces of nature give you something. Right, so if it's in the case of needing to grind down wheat, the wind, will push the windmill, or the motion of the river, the water flowing in the river will be able to turn a wheel, or the sun and the rain will bring crops up out of the ground. Like at some point, nature gives to you, and then the process can begin of exchange and refinement, and everybody getting what they need. And eventually you get what you need. Well, sometimes the hunt for a starting point is like that. In order to get this conclusion, you need that premise. But in order to get that premise, you need another premise. In order to get that premise, you need another premise. Just like the skeptic about logical arguments would say. The difference, though, is that there is a starting point that's provided by nature. In the same way that metal is dug up out of the earth, and wind causes the windmills to blow, that experience itself is the starting point. That when you experience something, when you see it, when you live through it, that becomes the ultimate starting point for your premises. And so it isn't just an assumption. It isn't just something that's made up. You could have made up anything, so why not make up the conclusion and be done with it? But instead, it's a gift that's given to you by nature and by the creator of nature. I hope it's something that strikes a chord with you, but enjoy your homework this week. There's a lot to cover. There's two different types of assumptions that we're going to be working through: conditional assumptions and then assumptions needed for indirect proof, or sometimes called reductios. So there's a lot to deal with. Again, this is going to be one of those weeks where probably you're going to spend a lot of time in the homework help forum. But good luck to you all, and I will see you all next week.